Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Helen Daly-Fisher from the Equality Rights Alliance. I suspect there are very few people online or watching the recording who haven't worked that out by now. But I'd like to welcome you all to this debrief to the Commission on the Status of Women 68, which a good many of us participated in very directly. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to them and their elders past and present. I also note that CSW is very fertile ground for us to make some real strides in relation to the human rights of Indigenous people across the world. And so this is a very useful space for us to be thinking about what's our obligation and what's our power in this space. I am, for anyone who is visually impaired, I am a middle-aged woman with a brown bob and hazel eyes, wearing glasses and a floral dress. So you can imagine me as you will. I am also one half of the team from Equality Rights Alliance, who were responsible for leading this year's NGO delegation to the Commission on the Status of Women. It was a very great pleasure to be able to be involved in that process, because this was absolutely the most engaged and I would say powerful group that we've had at CSW for many, many years, certainly in my experience, and that's about 10 years worth. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be involved in this process. And what we want to do here today is to start by doing a bit of a recap this morning on where we got to, and then this afternoon work on what's the future. So what do we do in order to make CSW68's outcomes a reality in Australia? And then what do we do to engage more fully and more effectively both at CSW and in other processes that are coming up? So let's begin, first of all, with a bit of a look at what some of the key overarching themes were at CSW. We'll start with some of the themes that came through in the discussion generally, and then move through to some of the overarching themes from the agreed conclusions. And then I'll hand over to Maddie to do a little bit more of an in-depth look at the text itself, some of the key things that jumped out for us. In that section and in the section around the general themes, we'd love it if you jumped in and let us know what you saw and heard. We're currently in the process of preparing our written report back on CSW68, which we're hoping will be a resource that people can use when they prepare for 69 and future commissions. And so anything that you provide to us in this session is all food for thought for us as we prepare that document. So, as I was saying, one of the great things about CSW68 this year was the Australians, who were just everywhere. We had more than 60 Australian NGO reps in New York, including, I think it was 27 first-timers, which was fantastic. It shows a real interest in growth in this area. And to me, it is a really magic moment where it feels like we might be getting a sufficient level, a sufficient size of capacity in Australia to engage in CSW, that it might start to become self-sustaining. And so that's a really exciting moment. We also had 130 people getting updates via email. So that included all the people who were back in Australia, which is more than twice, well, it is another 60 plus people back in Australia, which is again, a really useful resource for us to have, because at some points during CSW, I was reaching out to people late at night who were back in Australia, able to do things during their workday. So it's a really useful little benefit that we have that we haven't really capitalized on very much in the past. So looking forward to building that. We also had 42 people who are involved in the language negotiations very specifically. And as we said way back at the beginning when we were introducing CSW to a lot of people, you can have a number of very different CSWs. And in the past, Australian NGOs have tended to get very heavily involved in the side events and the parallel events, and maybe in some of the other functional processes, but not so much in the language. This was easily the biggest group of people I had who were interested in the language this time around. And it varied from people who felt like they were first-timers and just observing and participating in the training, all the way through to people who were contributing whole paragraphs, or in the case of Claire, and yes, Claire, I'm singling you out, preparing whole documents comparing multiple years worth of language. So brilliant stuff from the language group, and a really big group there. and too many events to count. And so one of the things that I would like to do in the next week or so is to get people to contact us at ERA and let us know if you ran an event. We got some of them captured in our Excel spreadsheet, but I suspect only a small percentage of them. So we'd love to know if you ran an event. Let us know the details, who was involved, what it was called, anything that came out of it would be great. And we can include that in the report that we're preparing. The other key features of the CSW work that we were doing were that we started this year expanding our training program. So previously we've run 2 training sessions prior to CSW. Last year, for the first time, we ran one in New York as well. And that New York training session was so successful, we ran it again this year. And again, it was well attended. And this year we actually got some international attendance at it as well through the Women's Rights Caucus. So I think that we are going to look at how we can build that into a bigger institution within CSW, because there is really an appetite for people who get to CSW and suddenly realize, actually, I need to know something about this language stuff. And so running one in New York, I think, is going to become a regular feature. We also had our priority theme workshop before we left, and that pre-departure briefing where we got to make contact with the Australian government delegation. We also maintained 5 comms channels plus a social media presence. Most of those comms channels were through the WhatsApp groups that you were members of. And then we had the 9 evening briefings, which from my perspective were really useful because they were an opportunity for us to crowdsource a sense of what the main themes that were emerging were, and to be able to test what we were seeing against what you were experiencing. And there was at least one pub stop, and I suspect that there were a couple of others. So a good time was had. But on the language piece specifically, we also got that priority submission into Australia quite early in the piece, which meant that we were able to then have really constructive conversations about some of the mechanics of CSW. One of my bits of feedback that we'll go through in the report is that I feel like we were a little too detailed, and that we're quite good at doing the detail in those priority submissions. But perhaps we need to be pushing the Australian government to get more of a statement about what it is that they think about the priority theme. Because what we got back from the Australian government was a lot of quite detailed information about what language they would support and what language they wouldn't, without them ever actually saying, we think the way to achieve gender equality through poverty eradication is blah, or this is what we think about financial institutions internationally. We never really got that piece cemented down. And it may be because Australia feels like we're all on the same page in relation to that, which I think in the international space they can justifiably say. But it would be useful for us to be able to say, this is what Australia stands for in that space. And so I think if our submission also takes an overarching approach, we may be able to push harder for that approach in turn from Australia. Those people who are involved in the language negotiations will know that we also produced 4 draft markups during the course of CSW. As usual, we had our 0 draft, the consolidation draft, and then we had Rev 1 and Rev 2. And at each of those stages, we had Australian NGOs involved in making comments not only on what was in the document, but what was missing from the document and what had been lost from the document. And that was an incredibly valuable resource that in some cases led to, we were actually able to trace a couple of spaces where the Australian language went through to the Women's Rights Caucus and then turned up in unexpected places in the room, because the Women's Rights Caucus takes the language to a whole lot of different places. So we'll be tracing those through in as discreet a way as we can, because we don't want to sort of expose our channels too clearly, but there is a real value in having that Australian input into the drafts of the agreed conclusions, because sometimes we really get that language through. And Maddie will talk about one of those examples in data later on. As you know, the priority theme for CSW was accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. And you'll remember from the evening briefings that there were a number of key themes that kept emerging from the events that people were attending and the discussions they were having with people. One of the ones that I think was really big was the role of women and girls in leadership and decision-making, particularly around some of the finance implications of thinking about the climate change and climate change reparations and climate change funding for response, and where women and girls were in that space, but also around the greater push to have gender impact analysis in public policy and in programs, and where women and girls were in the leadership and decision making around those. Climate change and poverty came up as a very strong theme, obviously, because this is an environment where climate change is sitting very front and center of people's emergency response, because we've got so many emergency responses going on at the moment in the world. And so when we had that discussion internationally, we were seeing a number of different issues competing for attention. And climate change was one of them that I think felt people who wanted to talk about climate change felt the need to be a little bit more forceful this year. Last year, we were still only 1 year out from having discussed climate change as a priority theme. And so I think the conversation felt as though it was rolling a bit. But the impression I got this time around was that the people in the climate space, once we started talking about finance, felt that the conversation wasn't as easy and that they needed to really put their elbows out. And the place where I think we really saw that was in the debt conversation, which I'll talk about a little bit further on. The education piece came through quite strongly, but at the 5 p.m. briefings, a number of people were noting that the higher education piece was missing from the education discussion, which I think is really interesting when we're talking about both poverty in terms of wage gaps and earning capacity, but also in terms of this issue around institutions and financing. And when you bring the missing higher education piece back across to leadership and decision making, there's a really interesting question to be asked about whether we are positioning women and girls for public participation and leadership and decision making. Not that higher education is necessary for leadership and decision making participation, and in fact, it's really important that we have a wide variety and a wide diversity of women represented in leadership and decision making, but that having people involved in institutions who are in a position to be able to design leadership and decision-making processes and to co-design processes that facilitate women's involvement is really critical, and whether we're building up that workforce globally for women to be able to do that. Another couple of themes that came through very strongly. Underpaid and undervalued work was a really strong theme around poverty. And that covered both issues around employment, wage gaps, the valuing of women's work within formal employment, but also women's informal employment and women's employment in conditions where their work is perhaps classed in a different way to the work performed by men. And then work that is not considered to be work, not yet recognised properly as work. So particularly caring for children and parents and other people, and the role that the global environment could play in being able to create a sort of standard discourse around underpaid and undervalued work. One of the things that I noticed come up was frustration from some of the Canadian NGO delegates working in the ILO space, so it's the International Labour Organization space, who were frustrated that they were still having to explain the concept of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value, and the fact that work of equal value kept getting dropped off, and that work for equal pay kept getting substituted, because that speaks to the whole conversation about what it is that we value as work and what value we place on different kinds of work. Gender-based violence also came up very strongly and came up in a range of different ways. I think the conversation itself didn't change enormously, but there was some squeamishness in the language negotiations from some of the more conservative states around language, for example, about intimate partner violence, which I found quite fascinating. There was at one point, one of the participants in the negotiations noted that they felt that intimate partner violence sexualized the issue too much. which seems to be an extraordinary statement to me. And so a little bit of squeamishness around perhaps some of the strength that's been achieved in the language around gender-based violence, which is interesting because I know that a lot of our advocates would consider that that language is actually a little bit weak. For example, it does nothing around power or coercive control. And so, pardon me, there's a real tension there about whether or not we have pushed the gender-based violence beyond the comfort zone of enough states that we're going to start hitting roadblocks. Another thing that came through strongly was the role of business and men and boys. And we saw that both in who was participating in CSW, for example, Chief Executive Women and Champions of Change Alliance, all being really strongly represented in that space, but also through references to the guiding principles on business and human rights coming through in the language negotiations quite strongly. That's a real change from last year when at 67 we didn't have a strong business presence at CSW. That's all, as we've said previously at the 5 p.m. briefings, that's always been a contentious space because some businesses come into the space without sufficient bona fides in terms of being able to set aside their own priorities and listen and learn. But I think that this year we saw really good examples of how to do that effectively and how to speak in a way that contributes to the discussion rather than dominates or tries to control it. So that discussion, I think, is one that we might see start to build out a little bit. A few more that came up. AI design came up quite a bit, and in particular at the 5 p.m. briefings, we had those references to designers starting to come into the conversation and tell us a little bit about the realities of designing AI and about the black box concept that you create your AI and you feed the information in and you literally do not know what is going to come out. And so the questions for us about where are the points of intervention. They're at both who's involved in the design and who are women involved in the processes both of designing and of making decisions about design. And then what is it that's being fed into the black box? Who's doing some thinking about a gender analysis on that? And then who's doing the thinking about making decisions about what's come out of the black box and what can be useful and what in fact reflects a patriarchal standpoint that we simply can't permit. So that was a really interesting discussion that I think had started last year but not properly developed, and we started to see that much more fully discussed this time around. The weaponizing of data was another one too. I know that a number of you attended events which were about the ways in which data can be used against women in terms of reproductive health and sexual rights, and around the way data can be used in ways that increase intersectional discrimination or intersectional marginalisation, particularly issues around data sovereignty started to emerge. We also saw gender in public policy and budgets come up really strongly, and this feeds back to the point I was making earlier about women in leadership and women in higher education. There is a much greater level of comfort, particularly among some of the mid-range states who sit between the conservative and progressive states, in the idea that public policy should be gendered and that gender-responsive budgeting and gender impact analysis should be a standard part of government. So we saw that come through quite strongly in the agreed conclusions language. And then intersectional discrimination proved to be surprisingly contentious, not something that is a big surprise for people who followed the language negotiations, but a little bit of pushback in the parallel event and side event space as well. Not a lot in that space. It's still very strongly understood as a critical concept in gender equality, but it's there was a little bit of unease about it in the language negotiations, and I think that spilled out into particularly some of the side events. A sense that complexity is the enemy here, rather than being the secret to us actually producing results that work for people. A number of other issues that came up that were sitting more strongly in that financing side of the theme. So sovereign and public debt was a really strong theme and a point of serious contention in the language negotiations. The debt paragraph was one of the two that didn't get closed. And so that debate, that very strong global north, global south divide was very apparent. And that shifted some of the relationships that we traditionally see in the room. So we were seeing a number of the let's call them the midline states, who have a tendency to move differently in relation to different issues, start to line up on global north, global south lines, and to see a sort of polarization occurring there. The issue that bubbled most strongly for me in that space was public debt and sovereign debt sitting in the development space and in the climate change response space, particularly in the funding of climate change response, and a very strong decolonisation narrative around a history of extractive policies and a present practice of extractive policies from the global north, from the global south into the global north, then being followed by a tendency to provide aid in the form of debt. One of the panels that I attended, one of the speakers put it very forcefully, saying, "We are owed this money, you have taken it from us." And so when debt financing for example, crisis response is put in place, there is a real sense in the global south that that financing is a sense of taking twice over, because resources have already been taken from the developing countries through a history of colonialism, and that imposing debt at this point, whether it's for climate response and climate preparedness, or whether it's in response to specific emergencies, is a double whammy, and one that is fundamentally unfair. So there were strong calls for the relief of sovereign debt and for the use of models other than debt for the providing of funds for development and for climate response. That same issue bubbled across the issue of the infrastructure, the financing infrastructure, and whether or not, for example, the World Bank or the IMF should be involved in the financing of climate response, whether they are the right bodies to be doing that, and whether or not they have a sufficiently robust gender impact analysis underway. Questions about whether we should be working with the Green Climate Fund, where it should be situated, and so on, were quite difficult to pick out in that space. I think that there was a problem in that the general level of knowledge about what's happening in that space, particularly around climate loss and damage reparations and preparedness funding, that discussion is not properly understood in a widespread way. And as a result, we didn't manage to make very much progress in relation to it. Women's access to finance and land also came up very strongly, and that was one that I think resonated for us, particularly in relation to the paragraphs on Indigenous women and girls, where there is some strong language that we'll talk about shortly. Any questions at that point? Nothing coming up at this stage. Do feel free to just pop something in the chat. I've got Maddie watching, so if you wanted to ask anything or add anything that you noticed, any themes that came up for you, do feel free to pop them in the chat. The other strong theme that came through was no poor solutions for poor women, which came up at one of the 5 p.m. briefings, and which I think is a really good summation of quite a lot of the themes that we've just talked about. So when we look at questions about financing, when we look at questions about debt, when we look at questions about what sort of resourcing is made available, whether we're talking on the national level or the individual level, what we're seeing is an underfunding and an under-resourcing of gender equality. Perhaps it's best described as a lot of goodwill and not a lot of oomph behind the fluffy statements. So valuing and redistributing unpaid work, as we said, came up very strongly as a way of beginning to begin that transference of power and resources to allow women to achieve gender equality and their human rights in their communities. Decent work for equal pay for work of equal value, decent work and equal pay for work of equal value came up strongly. And I was pleased to see that the decent work language appears to no longer be controversial in the negotiations. Social protections and publicly funded services was a really strong theme, particularly a strong push in the parallel events, in particular for intersectional approaches to the provision of social protections and public services. The idea being that you provide services that are designed around the needs of the most vulnerable, chances are you're probably going to be providing most of the needs of everybody else. And so let's start from that floor of complexity rather than trying to build accommodations for people into structures subsequently. Allied to that was a bit of a discussion and a strong theme about feminist infrastructure, both within countries and globally. The line that came up again in the 5 p.m. briefings was fund women's organisations like you want them to succeed. And I think it's really interesting that we had this discussion about the need to properly resource women's organisations at the same time as we had a move within the agreed conclusions to thin down some of the language about CSOs in the text. And so there is a bit of a sense, I think, that there is a pushback against properly resourcing and making free the activities of those women's organisations, particularly feminist organisations, but women human rights defenders generally, women environmental defenders, Indigenous defenders, and so on. And then the need to be able to protect those women human rights defenders was the other point of conflict. So we're seeing that there is perhaps reticence to support CSOs in some places, and in other places, outright hostility to the activities of women, whether they're defending the planet or each other or their culture. And so a real sense in the parallel events that this is an issue that needs to be pushed very hard. A sense, I think, in the side events that of acknowledgement that that is the case, but then a sense in the negotiations that that's quite a difficult thing to do and it adds complexity again. So interesting different messages coming through at different levels. And I think that this sat very interestingly alongside what we were seeing about the pushback on women's human rights in this space, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. So other themes generally, and as I was saying earlier, there were a lot of key human rights issues fighting for oxygen in the space at CSW this time around. So in addition to the impacts of climate change and decolonisation and history of colonisation, we had women in occupied territories and militarisation in a range of different environments. Gaza obviously sitting at the front of everybody's minds, but the Ukraine still sitting there, South Sudan, and a range of other places, Cameroon and so on, where we had live environments in which the human rights of women and girls are being brutally attacked. And without a strong UN environment for us to be able to have the conversations about the conflict underpinning those situations. And so we'll talk a little bit about the liquidity crisis in a moment, but I think we are at a point where the UN has been taken for granted for a little while, and we're now seeing that bearing fruit in that conversation about women, peace and security, conversation about militarisation has come through. It is now sitting in a space where states are not productively talking to each other.
We have a comment from Menika in the chat that you might want to read out.
And we have a comment from Menika in the chat, which involves me doing a little bit of clicking. Apologies, everyone. So Menika just noting about the intersections that they were seeing around gender-based violence in Australia and Canada and the different language that's being used around them, and around the need to fund women's organisations, especially in that culturally informed and community embedded approach. And you know, that we see that here in Australia in relation to, in particular, the calls for approaches that are sensitive and drawn from the experiences and communities of people from migrant and refugee backgrounds and Indigenous communities. So community-led, community-controlled and community-designed programs and organisations. And we here in Australia, and I know in a number of other countries, that was a particular experience during the COVID situation. So just noting that Menaka goes on to say most funding goes to Anglo or faith-based organisations that don't understand or appreciate differences in culture, which are carried over from the home country. I think that that's points back to that question about how we need to embrace the complexity and decentralise the power in these processes so that we get outcomes that are more effective for the women in those communities. The pushback on human rights, as I was saying, sat interestingly alongside the let's call it the weak recognition of states for the need to protect civil society organisations and women human rights defenders. And that pushback we're seeing come through in a number of different ways, but not markedly different from what we saw last year, I would say. And I think that a little bit of the oxygen that we were seeing taken away from the human rights discussion by the crisis environment that we're in also affected the conversation from the Conservative side. And I think that an attempt to control their narrative and their processes backfired to a certain extent. So they held their own parallel CSW process, which resulted in them being largely difficult to find in the first week. They were back in full force in the second week of CSW. And I think that most of the themes that I saw there were not new. There is one exception, which was the language around the family and unpaid care, which was unexpected to me, and which I think is probably a new approach, which involves alleging that action by the state to redistribute unpaid care within the family is an intrusion in the family which damages traditional families. And so states were being encouraged to refuse language in the agreed conclusions, which supported states having a role in the redistribution of care work. And so that was a new one for me. But otherwise, it's the Conservative position and the pushback on human rights sat in the standard spaces, which is an attack on the very notion of human rights as being universal and available to all women, an attack on human rights as a colonial construct, which is being imposed on developing nations or has been imposed through colonial practices, an attack on the UN itself, as being an entity which is captured by certain voices and which is not a friend of traditional values. And then the standard flare-up issues around abortion, women's physical autonomy, bodily autonomy, sexual rights, trans inclusion, and the human rights of trans people, particularly trans women and girls, and the standard conversations around sex and gender data. So those pieces we saw continue, perhaps with a little less oxygen initially, but then coming back strongly again in the second week. But I don't see those issues becoming any less of a threat anytime soon. And I do think that the people occupying those spaces are looking for new spaces to work into, hence the language around care and family. The issue about funding women's organisations, we've talked about elsewhere, but I will just note that some of that language around protecting civil society organisations and resourcing civil society organisations was one in the agreed conclusions at the expense of some clarity around what we mean when we talk about women human rights defenders, and a tendency to want to simply refer to civil society organisations, which unfortunately puts the focus onto institutions and entities and companies and organisations and other structures, rather than onto the individuals who are the ones who bear the violence on their bodies. And so this focus onto language about CSOs, rather than talking about what it is that women, girls, and other human rights defenders actually do, I think is a concerning trend.
We have another comment as well from Ludmilla in the chat.
And from Ludmilla, we've got a comment that conflict, poverty, violence, women, peace and security, and there's a nexus between those four things. And that it was poorly addressed by states and poorly reflected in response to the agreed conclusions. And I agree with that, Ludmilla. And I think that we went into CSW with a number of the states feeling uncomfortable about the Gaza situation, and in particular uncomfortable about their own responses to the Gaza situation. And as a result, that was not a productive or constructive conversation. It was a defensive conversation where people were lining up along predetermined positioning rather than having a serious discussion around the effect of occupation, militarization on women and girls. A couple of other quick ones. So sex and gender, I've already mentioned. That one came up. It was a little more muted than I was expecting this year, but I think, again, as we've said, that's possibly due to the first week energy being a little bit sapped into the parallel CSW process. The emergence of the guiding principles on business and human rights as an accepted document within this space, I think, has really been interesting. We've seen it occur. It was definitely there in 67. But I am not sure it was there in 66. It definitely wasn't there in 65. So it's something that's come into the space. They're guiding principles, so they're not binding. And so it's good to have it start to come up in the agreed conclusions where states are making commitments to do things. And so we saw the guiding principles come up both in the preambular paragraphs and in the operative paragraph. So it was good to see that. It was great to see that happening alongside more active engagement by corporate entities and businesses, because that means that we're not just talking into a bubble. You can get these situations where we come up with great language and we all endorse the great language, but the actual players are not in the room. This time around, we had some of the players there. And I think that that's something that we need to really strongly encourage. And finally, the UN liquidity crisis and the pushback on UN processes, which we've already touched on. Everybody is familiar with the fact that we operated to very strict time limits this time around. The 6 p.m. closed down, meaning that negotiations happened in a range of different spaces that we weren't able to access. We generally have limited access anyway, but we've managed to find ways to get into those spaces. I do just want to give a shout out to the Australian government for their very active and positive approach to trying to find ways of getting us involved in the language negotiations. They found ways for us to know what was happening in a timely fashion in the online component of the negotiations. They found ways to keep us briefed on what was happening when we were sitting outside the room. And they also found ways to keep us briefed about the small group work that was going on. And so that takes time and resourcing and, frankly, energy out of the people who are doing the negotiations. And so I really do appreciate that they did that in such an effective way. I think it's fair to say that the feed and the information that we were getting from Australia proved very useful to some of the other NGOs from other countries. As we fed through to the Women's Rights Caucus, there were a lot of times when information, for example, that Keishi was briefing us on was important for people in other states who are participating.
We have one more comment as well in the chat from Menika.
Thank you. And Menika just noting that we need to do much more work to access, educate. Sorry, my box is tiny. I'm going to make it huge. There we go. To access, educate and support women coming from religious backgrounds. Many of the organisations are controlled by religious faith leaders, and women keep their heads down, as I observed earlier in the week. A few women are sent to observe or spy on women expressing more progressive views, and that holds other women back from being open. Yeah, and Menika, I think one of the places I find that most frustrating is when they send young women, because we want to bring young women forward and we want to support them in the space. And to find that those young women are effectively being used in the space, I find really frustrating. I always, just an aside, I always say that nuns are the wild card, the joker in the pack at CSW. There are some who come there as envoys of the Vatican and who are following the Vatican's positioning in their involvement. And there are some who come there with just the best grassroots, open-hearted, human rights-based programs that I've ever seen. So the involvement of religious organisations, I think, has its place, but it's really important that we maintain the strength of that human rights basis for the engagement. Just something that we'll come back to in the afternoon session is to just keep an eye on what comes out of the Australian Law Reform Commission's report on religious discrimination and education in Australia. That's going to be really important for us to do some of that scene setting within Australia around what we expect from religious participation in gender equality stuff in Australia. For those of you who were still there in week 2 and were in the room when we got to the final session, this is the line that made my heart briefly skip a beat. For those who aren't familiar with the process, the agreed conclusions to CSW are ordinarily a consensus document which is negotiated in its entirety before CSW gets to its final session. However, in recent years, it's been increasingly difficult for us to close all the paragraphs before we get to the final session. And this year was no exception. We came to the final session with 2 paragraphs still open. They were a paragraph on women's health and a paragraph on debt. And with those 2 paragraphs still open, the normal practice at CSW is for the chair to then put the document to the committee for adoption. And the consensus part of the document happens at the adoption stage. So they don't vote on it. Everybody just says, yes, we accept the document. And then states lodge a number of reservations about paragraphs or issues that they felt they had to cave on in the negotiations, but which they have concerns about. This time around, something different happened. The chair went to put the document with 2 paragraphs still open with the facilitator's text in place for those 2 paragraphs. And Nigeria said, we have reservations on the text. We don't have instructions to proceed to adoption. And to be my interpretation of the look on the chair's face was that he was flummoxed. That hasn't happened before in my experience, that not only is somebody expressing reservations about the document, but they were prepared to stop the entire process in order to have those reservations noted and understood. The follow-on from that, Mauritania started to express some reservations, and then Mexico stood up and said, we absolutely need to have the agreed conclusions finalised. Cuba then pulled out a clever manoeuvre and suggested that we continue the negotiations over the weekend and through until the following Wednesday, at which point a number of hurried conversations happened on the floor, and Nigeria announced that they now had instructions to proceed to adoption because, frankly, nobody wanted to negotiate over the weekend or deal with the UN having trouble with that. Because it would have all had to be done online because of the liquidity crisis. So we got our agreed conclusions. The text for the 2 paragraphs that were not closed is the text that was designed by the facilitator at the beginning of the last session of negotiations. And ultimately, I would have to say it's not a bad document. Given that we're in an environment where the very foundations of what we're talking about are being contested, I think that we actually retained quite a lot of strong language and achieved a few new contributions to the text. So that's an achievement in this environment. Although I know that if you come into the space for the first time and think, gosh, this is so contested, why are we not making more progress? Why is the standard so low? In terms of where we've been for the last few years, I think we actually made some pretty good progress. And it makes me hopeful that the extent of the pushback on human rights has registered now for a sufficient number of states. And there will be some serious conversations coming up about what the pushback to the pushback looks like. Did we just get another comment in the chat?
We did. We just had a comment from Lynn Miller noting that it might still be on UNTV.
Yeah. Lynn Miller is suggesting you catch up if you missed it on UNTV. So it is literally www.untv.org something like that. But Google UNTV and you'll find it. And yeah, it was a real moment. The applause after Mexico stood up and the cheering, I have not heard in that room before. I thought I'd heard wild applause in that room in previous years. I hadn't heard anything quite like that. A severe lack of decorum occurred in the room. So anyone else, before we go into the detail on the agreed conclusions, would anybody else like to just add anything that they noticed or any themes that stood out for them? Feel free to come off mic if you like. Okay. In that case,
Sorry, Helen.
Oh, good. Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I'm off camera, but I just wanted to say that something I noticed more so in the side events and in the parallel events was that there was more mention and participation of boys and men and the importance of them in joining the conversation to overcome inequality, gender inequality, which isn't something that it was even a remarkable shift from last year. And in talking to people, it seemed like that was a pretty big shift over the last decade. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one to highlight because, I mean, we're seeing that here in Australia, right? We're seeing this conversation around what's happening in Victoria, the number of deaths we've had down there from gender-based violence. And sorry, trigger warning, I'm going to talk about what's been happening in Australia over the last couple of weeks. And then the attack in Westfield in Sydney, and the conversation around the deeming of the subsequent attack at a church in Sydney being a terrorist event, whereas the attack on women in the Westfield was not. I think that conversation about who's responsible for addressing gender responsive violence in Australia is currently bubbling. I'm hearing that on a lot of my social media feeds, people saying, where are the men? Why is it women marching in Victoria? Why is it women always carrying this work? And I think we started to see that conversation happening in a more productive way at CSW this time too. So I'm glad you've highlighted that, because in previous years, like the business and corporate piece, there's been a little bit of sensitivity around protecting the space and not wanting it to be dominated by men. And you will have noticed when you're at CSW just how many delegations are dominated by men, like how many of them are more men than women, and how many of them are in fact entirely men. And so I think there's always been a bit of a pushback against the conversation about men and boys, but it feels like we're at a stage now where certainly some of the Australian participants who came along were really in a position to be able to do some deep listening. And we're in a position to be able to act not from an assumption that they have the answers, but in fact from a knowledge that they don't and that they need to learn. And so I think that that conversation is maturing. And it's going to be interesting to see where it goes, both in terms of business and corporates and men and boys. Anything else that anyone would like to raise? Just come off mute if you'd like to. Gives me a chance to have tea.
Helen, this is Ludmilla. I'm on mute and not videoing because I'm just going too crazy this morning. I just thought the other thing that was interesting, and probably more so than in past years, was the connection that people were making to other pieces of work that were going on, and gender climate stuff is one of the really big examples of that. Links to the COP and what might happen in the future as well, and especially the discussions around debt and financing. That's come up in many different kind of situations. I hope to see that for other issues and other areas, because it didn't seem to come up. Again, I go back to the area that I'm working in, the WPS space, which to me, given what's happened in Australia with the huge amount of money that's been spent or nominated to be spent in the last couple of days for militarisation, is disappointing not to see those links made. So I think that might be an opportunity for us going forward as to how we address some of these things in Australia as well in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ludmilla. And I'd like to sort of crowdsource that and develop it a little bit if we can. We've got a little bit of time. For me, the issues that are starting to sit across venues, if you like, are the climate change, the funding for development, and loss and damage conversation, particularly around that. The pushback on human rights and the women human rights defenders piece. I had another one in my head. But yeah, are there any others that people see? The women piece and security piece, obviously. Are there any other themes or other international processes that you saw reflected in CSW or think should be reflected in CSW? I suppose another one is the conversation about the place of religion in relation to gender equality. And, you know, the right to freedom of thought, conscience and belief, and how that manifests in a world where we're trying to unpick patriarchy. And then, of course, the long-standing one about population development and bringing the external work being done around comprehensive sexuality education and sexual rights and reproductive rights into the CSW space. Are there any others that occur to people that we should be keeping an eye on?
Could I just jump in really quickly, Helen? I also want to connect it to the discussions that have been going on this week about how Australia responds to CEDAW, because I think this is where we should be cross-fertilising, because we've now got the evidence in front of us as well. Yeah, sorry. Now, thanks.
No, that's a really good one. And I think you could put that more broadly under the heading of the human rights Geneva piece coming across more strongly. The other one, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals. And Australia's really not very impressive response to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, and then from a domestic position, one for us to keep in our heads is, of course, the National Strategy on for Gender Equality. So there are a number of places where I think the job of taking what we do domestically into the international space is getting easier, because the international space is sort of got its eyes up and looking at the horizon a little bit more. It will be interesting to see whether the cultural differences between New York and Geneva at the UN prove a problem for us in terms of being able to bring CEDAW and CSW closer together. For those who aren't aware, the CEDAW committee does report to CSW. They produce a report of the CEDAW committee has usually 2 meetings a year, which comprise a number of different parts. And each year it produces a report, a summary of what they've done over the last year to the Commission on the Status of Women. And if you're ever looking for information about what the CEDAW committee's been doing, that summary to CSW is actually a really good place to go. It's you can find it on the UN Women website in the space for the official documents for CSW. It's the report from the committee is among the papers that happened before CSW. So it will be really nice for us to be able to bring some of that stronger piece across from Geneva, because Geneva tends to have a better discourse on human rights than the New York side of things. That's particularly, I think, the case in relation to LGBTIQA plus issues. And I see better engagement on issues of the rights of trans women and girls in the Geneva space. It's still at a very basic level and nowhere near adequate, but there is at least more of a sense that needs to be discussed in the Geneva space. Whereas here again at CSW, LGBTIQA plus language was lost immediately in Rev 1. It was cut out after the consolidation. And so that's depressing and distressing for people to see. But, in that space, I think we are in this space where we're only just beginning to accept the idea that human rights evolve and that the human rights process that we've inherited from the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is something that has a limited history behind it, and that we are still working out what many of those rights mean when you apply them to the lives of people facing all sorts of different forms of marginalisation. The thing I like to say that I was saying at the CEDAW training earlier this year is that UDHR turned 75 this year, and my mum turned 77. So yeah, this is the whole environment that we're operating in is new. It's all happened within my mum's lifetime. And so the extent to which we can use this cross-fertilization between different parts of the UN to strengthen that process of accepting that there will be an evolution in rights, and that we will have situations where, for example, the General Assembly passes the right to a clean and healthy environment, or where we get a resolution from the Human Rights Council about the human rights of LGBTIQA plus people. So that evolution process, I think, is what we're seeing when we're seeing that opening up to more than one sort of framework. We're seeing an acceptance that we're really all talking about the same thing. We're just talking about it at greater and greater levels of complexity. Anything else? Just come off your mute. Okay. Well, at this point, what I think we'll do is I'll do a couple more minutes of a couple of observations specifically about broad trends across the agreed conclusions. And then we might have a quick break to let people sort of absorb a little bit, do a bio break, stretch, and come back. So we'll do 10 minutes at the end of this. And then I'll hand over to Maddie, who'll look at some of the more nuanced and specific things that we like and don't like about the agreed conclusions. And at that point, we'd love it if you either ask questions or jump in about things that you've noticed in the text, because we're sort of crowdsourcing everything that we can find out of the document. We're hoping to produce quite a detailed description of what we see in the agreed conclusions. And so anything you can contribute to that is really useful. And we'll be distributing that not just to the people involved in this process in Australia, but also out to our international partners. So we're hoping that this process then starts us on a good footing when we get to the next agreed conclusions, which are 2 years away. Because at that point, you quite often have lost a lot of understanding of what's been going on. It's fallen out of our heads, or people have moved on. And so if we've written it down, we've at least got it there for next time. So some of those key overarching pieces that we saw in the agreed conclusion, we saw... I'll start first of all by saying that we saw the same pushback we usually get against the involvement of NGOs in the space. We may have seen, and we haven't confirmed this, but we may have seen an alarming new development around the shrinking CSO space, which is that it's possible that some of the conservative actors, NGO actors in the space, deliberately flouted rules in relation to NGO participation, possibly in order to further shrink the space, to silence us. So we saw some poor behaviour by people who had snuck into the negotiation room, which caused comment, caused people to be removed from the room, and then caused a real crackdown on our ability to be around the room. Chairs had been removed from the corridor outside the negotiation room, ostensibly because they were damaged, and when they were brought back, they were damaged. So I believe that. But we were prevented from sitting on the floor, which meant that we couldn't make easy contact with the people who needed to dart in and out of the room to talk to us. They had to come and find us wherever we'd ended up sitting. And so just that sort of, slightly passive-aggressive approach to limiting our involvement was, I think, emboldened by the fact that we were seen as being disruptive because there were a few people who were disruptive. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that those people were engaging in a deliberate pattern of discrediting us in the space. So the behavior involved was just so cartoonishly silly in the space that it just feels like it was deliberate. I might be wrong, but either way, we did still have to fight for the space again. And again, I do just want to highlight that Australia and other states who include NGOs on their delegations were critically important to us being able to understand what was happening in the room. There was real pressure on language around multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination across the document. We got to a sort of pattern where that would be the first thing that would be objected to in each new paragraph. To be fair, we were sticking it in everywhere because we knew that it would be under pressure. And so we were hoping to get the concept through in a couple of key places. And we all end up playing this rather frustrating game of balancing in the text, where states are able to say, we agreed to remove it here, so we've got to keep it here. And we saw that being used in a number of different ways in the room this time around. In particular, we saw some conservative states allowing greatly reduced language around particularly multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and then announcing that they considered that that was a concession for which they would seek balance elsewhere in the text. So this pushing down of standards on complexity in the document and nuance in the document is continuing. So that was concerning. Real pressure on language around girls, adolescent girls, and young women. We got a paragraph on girls, but it's a paragraph on girls. And there's this whole piece around adolescent girls and young women, which was missing. And in particular, it came under pressure in discussions around leadership and decision-making, and particularly in the climate space. There's very little, I think no reference to girls or young women in that space. And where girls was used, it was always used with strong caveats. So girls, where appropriate. And sometimes that caveat was put in place in order to achieve language about girls, rather in order to prevent there being language that was more appropriate, that actually described the caveat, such as adolescent girls or young women. So, for example, around comprehensive sexuality education or around women's health, language around girls as appropriate was preferred, rather than simply saying adolescent girls is what we're talking about here. In relation to online violence as well, there was a lot of debate about naming adolescent girls there. And so there is this sensitivity around adolescent girls and young women and around ceding them power that I think we need to be really aware of as we go forward. And one of the things that I personally will be feeding into the report is that we need a real focus on making sure that we have good examples of decision-making and leadership by girls visible at the UN at future CSWs, because a lot of states who don't have examples of that in their countries are openly saying girls aren't capable of leadership. And we can demonstrate that they are, that leadership in a properly supported and properly designed environment is something that girls are very good at. And we've got good examples of that in Australia. So I think making a note that in future we need to be pushing that forward is something that we've got good examples of in Australia might be useful to start pushing back on some of that reticence about language about girls. Is there a comment? I've just seen the number go up.
No, we just have a few comments on things coming up in the future, but I think we might come back to that a little bit later.
Cool. So we've Maddie's just keeping an eye on it and has noted that some of the comments in the chat there relate to things that we're going to get to. So we'll come back to your comments at those points. Pressure around gender transformative, gender responsive, and gender sensitive. Kudos again to Australia and to the rest of the Mountains Group for really pushing gender transformative. Also to the EU and to the UK and at times the US, all pushed language around gender transformative policies, gender transformative actions. We didn't get any of it, but it was good that they were pushing for it. Gender responsive was the fallback negotiated position a lot of the time. A lot of conservative states preferred gender sensitive. So think about women, but don't necessarily do anything about it. And so gender sensitive being something we tried to avoid in the text, and mostly we succeeded. It was one of the areas where states were demanding balance, but it was happening on both sides. And it did mean that we ended up preserving language around gender responsive policies in a number of places. As we discussed in the broader themes, business and corporate accountability came up in the discussion, and we preserved language in a couple of places around the guiding principles on business and human rights, which is really good to see. There was perhaps a little bit more willingness than I've seen previously among some of the mid-range states to accept language around states having an obligation to put guardrails around the activities of business, but we didn't see anything strong that went beyond the role of business in relation to their role as employers. So nothing about extractive industries, nothing about women as consumers, nothing about business practices being in line with human rights or environmental sustainability, and nothing about women and debt, women and commercial debt or consumer debt. So a couple of areas that I think were a missed opportunity, but which the inclusion of the guidelines, guiding principles on business and human rights becomes more important in the absence of those issues in the text. We've mentioned women and girls leadership already. And so I think that's the extent of the themes that I'm going to talk about here. I'm just going to what's in the chat. Maddie, is there anything that we need to raise here, or should we bring them up later?
I think we'll bring them up later.
Yeah, beautiful. So Juliana, just letting you know, we will, in the second session today, we will look at the future processes, such as the Summit of the Future and the SDGs and so on. Just Deggie's comment on wondering how gender diversity and rights are reflected. And I think coming back to the language about multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and one of the terrible things that CSW does to you is it makes you think in acronyms. I literally think MIFD. But that diversity piece was a bit limited. And the tendency was to prefer standalone paragraphs that described particular populations rather than to describe intersectional discrimination per se. And that bothers me. On the one hand, it's very important to have visibility of those particular populations and those particular women and girls. But on the other hand, it bothers me that we're siloing women and girls who are, for example, have disability or are Indigenous or any of the other few we got. It's a little bit like the problem with the list, in that the minute we start listing everybody, we lose somebody. And the first one to go will be LGBTQIA. And then after that, we start to lose things like nuance around disability and age and so on. And so that issue around the list is being replicated, I think, in the document in the use of population-specific paragraphs. We need those paragraphs, but we also need references to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination throughout the document so that it's understood that the women we make visible in the standalone paragraphs should still be visible throughout the rest of the document as well. All right, I think it is time for us to have a quick break. I'm going to say we're coming back at 28 past, exactly, precisely. So be back, but do take the time to walk away from your computer, have a little bit of a break. And while you're doing that, have a think about what it is that you might have seen. Open up the document. So open up the agreed conclusions. They were attached to that document, email that I've resent this morning. So it's called CSW Update 13. So have a look at that. And then have a think about what it is that you saw, you didn't see that you would have liked to have seen, or what it is that you might want to know about. Was this in the document? And we'll be back in 10 minutes' time. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, fantastic. So we will jump right back in. I am also coming from the EIRA offices, so I'm also on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. And I have to say, it is so lovely to see everyone's faces. For those of you who I saw in New York before, I think it's been about a month, if not more, since I saw a lot of you. So it's very lovely to be with you all today, and hopefully with more of us who are in New York later on this afternoon. So as we said earlier, I'm going to start going through some elements of the final text that we noticed. It's a 29-page document, so we're not going to go through everything here at all, and there will be things that we've missed because we're just picking out things that are interesting to us. So if there's something that we don't get to, put it in the chat. Okay, so Helen has already spoken to some of those key financing themes in the text, so I'm going to pick up some slightly different areas. Just a little bit of a recap for those themes that we talked about before we went on break. So we talked about references to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination being stripped, and you will see that as we go throughout. There's not a lot of intersectionality in the individual paragraphs. We also talked a little bit before we went on break about young women and girls, and something I just really want to highlight there, which Helen has already touched on, but I think it's worth repeating, is that when we see girls in paragraphs, we see it with the caveat as appropriate. And that caveat for as appropriate is attached to girls specifically, not young women. And the reason that we're picking up on that, there's something interesting, is because in a lot of the paragraphs where we're talking about girls, we're really actually talking about young women. And that's language that we see elsewhere in the text. So I think that that is something to keep an eye on in future years, is why are we using the phrase girls and not the phrase young women. Okay, so first new thing. One really clear positive outcome for us this year was the inclusion of specific language on disaggregated and individual level data, which of course, for those of us who were in New York, we know that IWDA did some really fantastic advocacy on. I don't think we have anyone here in the room at the moment from IWDA. Apologies if there is, and I've missed you. But just to really quickly get away from the text itself, IWDA's work in New York was a really great example of what you can accomplish by just focusing on one really specific area of the text, because we got that specific mention in of the individual level disaggregated data, and you can see it that Helen's just brought that up there. So you'll also note that we right now are in a preambular paragraph. When we go down to the operative level paragraph on data, we do lose that individual level disaggregation, but we've retained the references to gender data. So we're still seeing this as largely positive overall, and something that we can keep building on the advocacy on. Did anyone want to comment a little bit on this data section before I keep moving through? No, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Okay, we'll keep going. So while we're talking about data, we're really happy, as I said, that we've started talking about gendered data. However, we did notice that when we had those discussions of sex and gender data, we were seeing that used as vehicles for transphobic rhetoric a lot. And we've also observed a little bit of wariness and fatigue among the LGBTQI activists who do manage to make it to New York. There's a wariness there that when we're talking about gender, maybe what we're actually talking about is sex essentialism, basically. So we really feel that going forward, having LGBTQIA advocates and feminists at CSW will be really crucial, so that we can continue monitoring that language and making sure that when we're seeing the increase of this gendered data discussion, we're not seeing that used to sneak in those quote unquote traditional homophobic values. So relatedly, and also in relation to Daggy, what you were saying before in the comments, we didn't see a lot of stuff on LGBTQIA plus people. So I'm going to use the phrase SOGS. Hopefully everyone knows what that's referring to, but basically that's the United Nations version of when we would say LGBTQIA plus in Australia. They're saying sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Helen, I think that's the whole, yeah, Helen is nodding at me that I got the whole thing there. So Helen touched on this earlier, but there is a continued absence of explicit language on SOGS issues here. It's not a new trend. But the continued absence of that, we think, is a particularly dangerous omission because it's a particularly vulnerable group. And when we're looking at a theme of poverty, we know that this is a group that's vulnerable to poverty and faces an increased risk there. We do have one mention of sexuality, which is recognizing that the human rights of women include the right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on all matters related to their sexuality. However, this paragraph was not included ad ref, meaning that that's not one of the ones that states sort of all formally agreed on when they were actually sitting around the table. And that is the only reference to sexuality in the entire document. So you can just see Helen doing a little find and search there. You will notice as she's searching, it is the only mention of the word sexuality. So even in a broader context where maybe we're not talking about LGBTI issues, we're talking about health and education more broadly, we're still not using the phrase sexuality at all, which I think is very interesting that that's still where we're at. I'm just going to pause because I'm aware that I'm moving through a lot of material quite quickly. Did anyone want to comment on that, either on the SOGIASC themes or the word sexuality in other contexts? Okay. I'm just going to pause for a second to make sure. Okay. Brilliant. We'll keep going. So yeah, that's something that we want to keep watching in future years, because just because it's an ongoing trend and a continued absence doesn't mean it's not something that we should be continuing our advocacy on. We talked a little bit in the first half of this session before the break related to advocacy about that shrinking space because of the liquidity crisis. And for those of you who were in New York, you would remember that we had a lot of conversations while we were there about the shrinking space for civil society engagement in New York around this event. And I'm going to use the phrase CSO, which is civil society organizations. In Australia, we would say like NGO, nonprofit. If you're in that group, you're amongst the CSOs if you're there at New York at the United Nations. So this was a little bit of a mixed bag in the agreed conclusions, which is the theme for all of the issues we're going to talk about. They're all a mixed bag. We were happy to see in paragraph 47, which is a preambulary paragraph. Hopefully everyone knows what Helen and I are referring to when we talk about preambulary versus operative language. I'm going to act on the assumption that you do. If you don't, please write in the chat and either Helen or myself can come back to it. But on paragraph 47, you'll see that we do have the Commission recognising the quote unquote major contributions of CSOs, including feminist and Indigenous organisations, which for us from ERA are two of the phrases that we're watching out for because we're a feminist organisation. So it's not to say that feminist organisations are the only ones that should be recognised. It's just because at Equality Rights Alliance, as a feminist organisation, that's what we're reading for. But I will note that even though we have feminist and Indigenous groups named explicitly here, when we get to the relevant operative sections, we start to lose that specificity. So even in that long listing out of things that we were talking about before, that falls away later on. We do have, however, in those later sections, the inclusion of a call for an increase in public and private financing. And I'm just going to read out this phrase. They say, including robust, sustainable, flexible multi-year financing for civil society organizations. I don't know if you can see Helen, but she just did this in the background because that's a big win for us. That's really fantastic for feminist advocates and very in line with the ERA's domestic advocacy, if you follow what we do at home regarding sustainable funding for women's organizations. Like I said earlier, we would have liked to see that call out specific groups more explicitly in line with that earlier language in paragraph, what was it, 47? Thank you, Helen. But still, we will take it. A win is a win. We're also happy to see the directive in that operative language. I think it is SSS, the paragraph, which talks about states needing to protect civil society actors from harm. That to me is positive that that's there. But I will say, if you read the full long paragraph, to me, it's softened by the broader context of the paragraph because I read that language as part of this broader directive to enable a safe environment for the protection and promotion of human rights, which is good, but it does soften it from being a specific call to protect advocates and other actors. So we're losing that protection for feminists there. I'll also note that having this language be previously agreed as we move forward might continue to become, or I should say, become particularly relevant as we have Saudi Arabia move into the chair role. So that's something to bear in mind as we go forward. So I'm going to move on, but I just want to pause because we've just zoomed through a bunch of text again. Does anyone have any comments on that civil society inclusion? No? I'm just going to quickly change my view so I can make sure I can't see anyone having a hand up. No? Everyone's still with me? Okay, I will keep going then. So now we're going to come to sexual and reproductive health. So like I said earlier, the theme for basically every issue that I'm going to pick out is mixed bag. So the retention of any language, I would say, related to sexual and reproductive health is a positive. And it was particularly encouraging to see multiple paragraphs that speak to this, particularly language that relates to human rights. So I'm just going to draw attention to paragraph KK, where we have recognizing that the human rights of women include their right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on all matters related to their sexuality, which is that I noted before, including sexual and reproductive health, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So this, to me, this language is particularly important while we have access to abortion and other reproductive health services as really contentious globally. It is good to see language on this here. But coming back to the mixed bag theme, I'm going to caveat this enthusiasm with the note, like I said earlier, that these paragraphs are not agreed ad ref, which means that they were not officially approved by everyone sitting down the table. These are the ones that kind of got through at the end. And something to think about as we move forward is when we have language like that that's really positive, are states going to treat that language in the way that they would treat other previously agreed language? That's something to think about. I can see Helen nodding in the background. I'm just looking over at her occasionally. So does anyone have any comments on this little section on sexual and reproductive health? No, not so far. Feel free to disagree with me, by the way, at any point. If I'm pointing out something and I say, this is really good, and you're like, actually, that's totally inadequate from an Australian perspective, that is also really helpful for us to hear. No? Okay. All right. Then I'm going to move on to women, peace, and security. We've already had a little bit of discussion on this, and I know you said earlier that you thought that this was quite thin on the ground. Women, peace, and security was one of those areas where we had a bit of a copy-paste exercise from previous years. So we have in paragraph 18, a very short, basically, we recall and reaffirm the women and peace and security agenda. I did like seeing personally that full, equal, and meaningful participation language continued to be included. I'm flagging that here, even though this is a really tiny paragraph, because I think that that particular phrase is something that we're going to want to keep an eye on. And I'll mention that more in a moment when we come to Indigenous women and girls. But I just wanted to flag that because this is, I think, the first time that I've mentioned it. When we get all the way down to the operative language on women, peace, and security, we've got two things going on. So first, we've got a big paragraph that is a copy-paste of the language from CSW67. So it's going to depend how you want to see that. Maybe you see the copy-paste as, yay, we haven't lost anything. Maybe you see it as, oh, we didn't gain anything. We do have an additional part. So we've got a whole second paragraph right after that. And I apologize, Helen, I haven't written down what paragraph that is. But we have an additional little paragraph which is linking us to the theme of poverty. And I think if you search genocide, that one will come up. So I really like that we kept the specific phrase, the human rights of women, instead of just women's rights, because we know that human rights can backslide in the context of conflict and post-conflict scenarios. So I think that's good. And honestly, as we talked about in New York, for those of you who are there, anytime that we get the human rights of women instead of women's rights, that's something that we want to keep. So in this additional part that I think Helen is trying to find, I apologize, Helen, that I didn't give you the paragraph. We have this little string of particularly in the situations of, which is where we got that specific mention of genocide, which I know was contentious to some people because we had the agreement earlier in the negotiation that we weren't going to reference Gaza. And there was a little bit of a discussion at the time of whether that was a way to sneak this language in. I think that the thing that is missing in that little list where we have the genocide and other war crimes mentioned is a specific reference to sexual violence. For me, that feels like a really glaring omission to this paragraph in the context of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But overall, I think this is probably a positive addition to that language from the previous year, and they're bringing it to the theme on poverty. So you can, I think, start to see that coming in there. I'm going to pause here because I know that we have some people who work in women, peace and security specifically. Does anyone want to comment a little bit more on these WPS paragraphs? No?
I feel like I need to say something, Maddie.
Yes, go for it.
I find this personally very disappointing, particularly given the context at which CSW was taking place and the fact that next door in the Security Council, at the same time as these paragraphs were being read, there was all sorts of furor going on, not just about Gaza, but a whole lot of other areas. And I just think it's a cop-out. However, using the term genocide is probably the one piece of terminology that moves this forward. Unfortunately, not connecting genocide to specific contexts, and I get it. It's politically dynamite why it wasn't done. I don't know how much that helps. The other thing is that I had, because I got to write drafts of the earlier paragraphs, I was highly frustrated that the first paragraph, paragraph 18, didn't actually push things forward in terms of leadership and decision making, because that was such an important theme for the rest of what was going on in the discussion around poverty. And I think it's a missed opportunity because it's something that connecting it to other aspects of what's going on in Australia, but internationally, I just see as really critical. Otherwise, we come back to home, motherhood statements and the whole of using the terminology around what meaningful means is meaningful to who, in what context, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just leave it there. I think people know I'm not wrapped in this stuff in the two paragraphs, but thanks.
No, thank you, Ludmilla. You've said some really great things that I just want to pull out of context for people. I'm really glad that you've also touched on the meaningful thing. It's encouraging to me that I'm not alone in thinking that that's significant. And I'm going to come back to it in a second with the Indigenous girls. But just in case anyone is not familiar with what Ludmilla is referring to when she was talking about the Security Council, at the time when we were negotiating this, we had the Security Council meeting to discuss Gaza. And I think it was, I don't know if it was the day that we looked in this language, but it was certainly in the final days that we had the US, their original resolution to call for a ceasefire in Gaza was not agreed upon by state. So it was quite a tense time. So thank you for pointing that out, Ludmilla, because I do think it probably was on the minds of people in the room. Although, of course, we can't say how much that contributed to the text, but it is certainly something to be aware of. And meaningful to whom, I think, is a really great question to think about. And as I just said, very relevant when we come to Indigenous women and girls. Unless anyone else has anything to add to that Women, Peace and Security discussion? No? If you think of things after the session, by the way, that you would like to tell us on any of these points, because I'm aware that we're covering a lot of ground, please feel free to send us an email. We're going to hopefully keep these conversations going. So if someone comments something that sparks a thought later on, do let us know. But we're going to move on now to Indigenous women and girls, which I think it's fair to say was a big priority for us, both as an organisation and broader, for the Australian delegation as a whole. So this is something that we were watching really closely. And we were really pleased to see both initial and operative paragraphs on Indigenous women and girls. You know, as much as we're aware of that siloing issue that Helen was talking about earlier, I think it is a positive to have explicit mentions of Indigenous women and girls in the text, particularly that phrase, full, equal and meaningful participation, which we've already talked about a little bit in relation to the design of policies and programs. So just for some context, that phrase was included in the agreed conclusions of CSW66 for Indigenous women, but we ended up losing it the next year at CSW67. So I think it's really positive that we got that back in. And it's the reason that I highlighted that in the Women, Peace and Security section, because we had an earlier revision, I can't remember what version it was, I apologize, that had full, equal and meaningful in a bunch of other paragraphs, but then we got to Indigenous and they said effective participation instead of equal participation, which to me felt like quite a concerning shift, that we were siloing this group and then talking about effectiveness, which is why, Ludmilla, I'm really glad that you picked up on that meaningful language, because I think there's something similar going on there as well. That's the language that we had in 67. We had effective participation instead of equal participation, which is obviously very different. And in the same way, Ludmilla, meaningful to who? Effective to whom and for whom. So I think that that's something that we should continue to watch in future. And we were very happy to see a return to that established full, equal and meaningful language in the document. The continued inclusion as well of free, prior and informed consent coming from an Australian context, we were very happy to see that. I'll note as well that while for those of us in the Australian delegation, this feels like really obviously a key issue, for a lot of other states in the room, Indigenous issues, they don't see them as relevant to their national contexts. So it's really important that as an Australian delegation, we keep going up and pushing this language, because for a lot of countries, it's just not on their radar at all. So does anyone want to add anything else on Indigenous women and girls at this point? There's a lot more we could say about this, by the way. I'm just picking out a few things that we've noticed. No? Okay. Well, those were the highlights that I've thrown out, and you can see that you can get really lost in the weeds of this document, because I've been talking for about 20 minutes at this point, and we've gone through, what, 3 or 4 paragraphs, not even with a fine-tooth comb, and this is a 29-page document. So if there are things that you've noticed that we haven't talked about, please do bring them to us. And I might open it up at that point. Were there any other paragraphs that people were watching, either in New York as it was going on or after the fact, that you want to say anything about? Yeah, Ludmilla, go for it.
This is more a broad statement about how the agreed conclusions were constructed. And I just want to say that one of the things that I think that we saw happen was a trimming back of the language and the thinking and the time, not only because of the liquidity issues and only being able to be in conversation directly with each other across the states and the parties, but I think that it has, in fact, this year had an impact in what has gone into the document. And clearly there were decisions that were being made, not so much for expediency, but just to get through the thing and to keep people moving, because you had to get out of the room by 6 o'clock. And I think that shows in the language in the way that it hasn't shown in the past. So I'm not just talking about the WPS stuff, I'm talking about other paragraphs there as well. So I think somehow that's an important comment we need to convey to people as well. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And I'll just say as well, on those couple of paragraphs that Helen and I have both raised, where we're talking about, well, this wasn't agreed by states in the room, we don't know what would have happened with those paragraphs if we had had the time to continue negotiations past 6 o'clock. So it might be that we would have gotten better language, that language would have been axed. So we're coming to these issues in kind of a weird year and a weird context. And certainly we observed the same thing that you're talking about there, Ludmilla, where in those last couple of days, we would start to have a discussion and then someone would go, we don't have time, let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So it certainly impacted on the language. Difficult to say if that benefited us or not. I'll just throw it back over to Helen, who wants to add something.
And the reason I'm raising my hand is because we have to do the swapping of mutes. So, and the thing that I would add to that, I think, is that I think it's fair to say there's a loss of nuance in the document. So when we look at things like losing specific references to types of civil society organisations and references to multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, it is partly because we didn't have time to have the conversation with states to make them feel more comfortable with the language. We've relied on tweaks to previously agreed language a lot in this particular set of agreed conclusions. And I think there are two things going on there. One is that for conservative and what you might call soft conservative states, we're starting to have made so much progress that we're coming up against their boundaries. And so, we're getting to the point where we actually need to win some hearts and minds in relation to the language now, to convince people to change values and really deeply held views at national and cultural level, as well as individual negotiators. And I think the other thing that's happening is that because we had that crunch, there was just less time for negotiators to sit down with each other and say, when we use these words, what we mean is. And we saw that happening last year when language around technologically facilitated gender-based violence was proposed by Australia and others. And that was a new phrase, which doesn't have much pedigree in the international space. We know what we mean by it in Australia, but it was a bit of a surprise to some other states who went, well, what does that mean? It's quite a long phrase, what's encompassed by it. And so we had time last year to produce some fact sheets, to work with the Safety Commissioner in the CSW space when she was there, and to be able to sit down with some states and have some conversations about what their level of comfort was around the language. And that's how we ended up with a negotiated version. We didn't use technologically facilitated gender-based violence. I think we ended up with gender-based violence, which is facilitated by technology or something like that, because that worked for people trying to explain back to their national capitals. In this situation, we just didn't have time for those sorts of conversations. And so I think that's the point where we lost something important. But then again, we are in a very constrained space. And I know that a number of the conservative actors in the space were also concerned about the lack of time, because they felt they didn't have enough time to be able to put pressure on the text language. And so you 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's not a good thing that the UN is forced to close at 6 p.m. Can we say we would have had a stronger document if we hadn't been closing at 6 p.m? No, I don't think we can. I'm going to hand over to Maddie.
Okay, thank you. So we just have to do a slight little dance every time and make sure that we're not getting feedback because we're in the same room. But I just wanted to really quickly add something on the previously agreed language, because both Helen and I have talked about previously agreed language a little bit in passing as something that holds power and has some weight in the negotiations. But I just wanted to flag really quickly something that a couple of people noticed while we were there, which was states bringing up previously agreed language and saying, well, we know this is previously agreed, but actually we don't agree on it, so we have to go back. We're not gonna give it weight just because it's previously agreed, which is a bit of a shift. So we're talking about this weight that previously agreed language has, but I just wanted to flag for people that that is not necessarily a given moving forward. Lynn Miller, I can see that you have your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Yes, I did. And in fact, that I wanted to pick up on what you've just said, Maddie. I think that given the way that we are now, that we constructed what will become previously agreed language this year, I'm just trying to think ahead of both the liquidity issues, both the fact that we have Saudi Arabia as the chair for next year, setting the agenda for the next 5 years, the implications of using very rushed, or let's take that back for a moment, using language and negotiations which were not the kinds of negotiations that we've had in the past, in terms of at least having a bit more of a chance to talk through some things. I'm just thinking about the possible implications of that, and just, I guess, thinking about how we make ourselves not just more mindful about this, but how we prepare for that in advance as well, by doing more work, I guess, at home, but also if we have regional partners and if we have international partners, which is my case. In fact, next week, I've got a similar situation to what we're doing right now with our international partners, talking about how do we work globally across our different regions to take this language in terms of the context and to move it forward as well. I think the space has shifted. Where it's going to, I think, is still the question, which is what the both of you have been raising. But I think the space has shifted, and having the liquidity issues, the fact that we have to shut the door at 6 p.m., etc., having potentially a greater impact in the future if you've also got a conservative lead at CSW. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing our attention to that issue of the chair going forward again, because I know that both Helen and I have referenced it a little bit, and I think it is important to bring up and think about as we start to do that kind of forward planning. And we'll come to that a little bit more in the second session as well, when we talk about next steps, thinking about CSW 59. So on the break, if anyone has any thoughts over that, over lunch, on Ludmilla's comments there, do come back prepared to share, because we want to talk about that, about how we can act strategically going forward. I'm just going to pause a little bit. Does anyone have any questions about the language in the final text, even about the specifics, about what stuff that we've already raised means, or about issues that we haven't talked about? It could be your domestic issues as well, and where they got in the language. Do we have... Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. If you think of questions as we keep going on, please feel free at any point to interrupt and put your hand up. I will keep monitoring the chat for the rest of the sessions today. So if you think of things as we're talking, don't worry that we've already moved on. We can always come back and talk about the language. So I'm going to pass back to Helen. Thank you for indulging me in my brief time leading the meeting this afternoon. So over to Helen.
Thanks, Maddie. There we go. Click all the buttons. All right, so that brings us to the end of this part of our debrief. We're going to reconvene today at 2 p.m. The idea from this point is that we want to have a conversation about what the steps are going forward. So both what are we going to do internationally in terms of CSW itself, and then other related processes that we need to be keeping an eye on and be talking to each other about, particularly as different parties among us get involved in different areas. And then also, how do we then take what's come out of CSW this time around and start to apply it to the domestic work that we're doing in Australia? How do we hold the Australian government to account? In fact, all Australian governments to account for their obligation to implement what they've committed to under the agreed conclusions. How do we start to do the work going forwards to the next level of CSW work? We've got a review year coming up. And so we'll have that conversation after lunch. We are going to be making the recording of this session available, because we've got a significant number of people who couldn't commit to a whole day on CSW, having already committed to weeks and weeks of it. So we will be forwarding a link to this subsequently. So if you do have any questions that come up about the language, about the themes that we've picked out, questions that you have about how the language might apply to your work, have a think about them during the break. And when you come back at 2 p.m, be ready to talk about, first of all, if you're going to be involved in international processes, we'd love to hear about it. It's really important that we have this centralized space where we can all exchange information about who's doing what. It would be good to hear about what sort of international networks you're involved in and whether they're involved in any of these processes, and whether we might be able to use that connection as a way of getting information into this group. And it would be good to know whether or not, what sort of areas you might want to be using the agreed conclusions in your local advocacy. And I'm just noting for those who are wondering how to join the 2 p.m, that email from me, which is called CSW Update 13, has 2 links in it. We're using a separate link for the 2 p.m. meeting. So you don't need to come back to this meeting. You need to use the link that's in that document. If you can't make it to the second session, that's fine. We're going to record that one too and distribute that through to the same group of people who are getting the emails. Menaka, question from you?
Quite irrelevant, but I noticed we've got a few
We're not
meetings
hearing you,
on I unmuted myself.
Yep,
Okay.
got you now. Got you now.
Okay. Probably not relevant here, but I saw that we have meetings on the 25th of April, which is Anzac Day. Okay. So
no. So that was a mistake at our end. We're going to be editing this out of the video. So that was the original date for what's happening today. And then we shifted it forward to this week.
So 25th doesn't mean anything.
Oh, that's right. No, wait. The email that I forwarded to you this morning is the original one,
Okay.
not the correct.
Oh, that's all right. So I don't have to worry. That's all. That's all.
But
okay.
You get a gold star for detail. Well done, Menaka. You picked that
I'm
up.
not a detail-minded person. People can sweep things in front. Thank you. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. Okay.
Okay, fabulous. We'll see you.
See you. Bye.
And we'll have a discussion about what's coming up.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a good lunch.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.